My husband and I were on vacation for our first anniversary, but while I waited for our return flight at the airport, he sent me a message saying he regretted marrying his second option and asked me to go home alone because he couldn't keep up the act. After 2 weeks, he called me in tears. After reading this notice, I left when I moved out, and he certainly didn't see a twist coming. Our first anniversary trip had been my dream. A beachfront resort, candlelit dinners and uninterrupted time together. It felt like the perfect way to celebrate the year we had spent building our life as husband and wife. I had planned every detail right down to his favorite wine for the sunset toast. He seemed happy, or at least I thought he was. But now looking back, there had been signs, subtle ones. He wasn't his usual self during the trip. He kept checking his phone, brushing off my attempts to hold his hand during our walks, and spending far too much time staring at the ocean instead of talking to me. I chalked it up to work stress. He always told me I overthought things, so I convinced myself I was imagining the tension. Our last day was quieter than I expected. I had hoped for one more romantic dinner, but he suggested we stay in and order room service. He barely touched his food and kept glancing at me as though he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. I thought he might be planning a surprise, perhaps a gift or some heartfelt gesture to end the trip on a high note. When we got to the airport, he suddenly excused himself to grab a coffee. I sat at the gate scrolling through my phone, already dreading the grind of life waiting for us back home. My phone buzzed. It was a text from him. I almost smiled thinking he was being cute, messaging me from a few steps away, but when I opened it, my world stopped. He wrote that he couldn't keep pretending anymore, that he regretted marrying me because I wasn't his first choice and he had settled for his second option. He said he was sorry, but it wasn't fair to either of us to keep living a lie. He wasn't coming back with me. He told me to go home alone and that we'd talk later when he was ready. My heart raced. My breath caught in my throat and the bustling sounds of the airport blurred into a dull roar. Was this a joke? A cruel prank? I frantically looked around, expecting to see him watching me, waiting to say it was all a mistake. But he wasn't there. He had left. I reread the text, hoping I had misread it. But no. The words were right there, glaring at me, ripping my heart to shreds. My hands trembled as I tried calling him, but it went straight to voicemail. The man I had vowed to love and cherish for the rest of my life had just abandoned me at an airport without a single shred of decency to explain himself face to face. I sat there staring at my phone, willing him to reply, to call back, to say anything that made sense of what just happened. Passengers walked around me, oblivious to the emotional wreck sitting among them. My flight was called and I mechanically got up, dragging my carry-on as though it weighed 1,000 pounds. The flight attendant smiled as I boarded, but I could barely manage a nod. The seatbelt felt suffocating as I sank into the seat by the window. My tears threatened to spill, but I refused to give them the satisfaction. I clenched my fists, my mind spinning with disbelief and questions. How could he do this? Why now, after a year of marriage? And why call me a second option? What did that even mean? The plane took off and I stared out at the clouds, my tears finally escaping in silent streams down my face. I wanted to scream, to cry out at the injustice of it all. But instead, I sank deeper into myself. Memories of our relationship played like a cruel montage in my mind. The way he had proposed to me, the laughter we shared during our honeymoon, the promises we made, had it all been fake? Had he been faking every smile, every kiss, every I love you? Mid-flight, I broke. I opened my phone and typed a message. Why? Why are you doing this? The reply came almost immediately, cold and detached. He said he was tired of pretending to be someone he wasn't, that he had tried to make it work but couldn't force feelings that weren't there. He admitted he married me because I was safe, dependable and easy to please, but I wasn't the woman he truly wanted. He said he thought he could grow to love me, but he was wrong. My stomach churned as I read his words. I felt humiliated and discarded, like I was nothing more than a placeholder. Safe and dependable, that's all I was to him? I typed back furiously asking who this first option was. Had he cheated on me? Was this about someone else? He didn't reply. By the time we landed, I was numb. My heart felt like a hollow shell and my mind was clouded with anger and despair. I didn't even bother trying to call him again. I knew there was no point. He had made his decision. The man I had trusted with my heart had ripped it out without a second thought. I arrived home to our empty house, though it didn't feel like home anymore. Every corner of it was a reminder of the life we had built together. Or rather, the life I had built while he pretended. His shoes by the door, his favorite coffee mug on the counter, the framed wedding photo on the mantel. The framed wedding photo on the mantel. They all mocked me with their presence. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to destroy the reminders of him, but I didn't. Instead, I sat on the couch, staring at nothing, letting the weight of his betrayal crush me. I spent that night replaying his words in my head, trying to make sense of what he had done, but no matter how many times I turned it over, the conclusion was the same. I had loved someone who never truly loved me back. And now I was left to pick up the pieces of a life shattered by his lies. Update 1. I didn't know what to do. Should I wait for him to come back? He eventually would, right? The silence of the house was unbearable. It wasn't the comforting quiet I'd once loved, the kind where I could hear the soft of our lives together. Now it was oppressive, a void echoing the betrayal that had shattered everything I thought we had. I wandered through each room like a ghost, every piece of furniture, every photograph on the wall, reminding me of the life I had built with him, the life he had so easily walked away from. His clothes hung neatly in the closet, his favorite watch lay on the nightstand, and the bathroom still smelled faintly of his cologne. I wanted to hate him, to despise the man who had turned my love into a cruel joke. But I was hollow. I was drained. For days I barely ate or slept. My body moved on autopilot while my mind replayed every conversation, every decision, every moment I had shared with him. I kept asking myself the same question: how could I have been so blind? The answer was as devastating as the question. I loved him too much to see the reality, or maybe I didn't want to see it. By the third day, the initial fog of heartbreak began to lift, replaced by a simmering anger. He had left me to deal with this mess while he disappeared, probably convincing himself that he was the victim of a loveless marriage. I wasn't going to let him define the narrative. I wasn't going to stay and wallow in a house that no longer felt like home. So I made a plan. It took me a week to sort everything out. I boxed up my belongings, separating what was truly mine from the things we had bought together. Packing felt therapeutic, like I was reclaiming pieces of myself that I had given away too freely. His things I left untouched. Let him deal with the empty shelves and the void where my presence used to be. I also arranged to end the lease. The house had been a rental we'd chosen together during our early days of marriage. It felt fitting to leave it behind, to start fresh, somewhere that didn't carry the weight of his lies. I contacted the landlord and scheduled the move-out notice to align with my departure. Finally, I sat down to write. The letter wasn't easy to write. Every word felt like dragging a blade across my heart, but I knew it had to be done. I needed to say my piece to make him understand the gravity of what he had done, not just to me, but to the person I had been before him. I started by telling him I was leaving, not just the house, but the marriage. I wrote about the sacrifices I had made, the love I had poured into him, and the trust he had shattered with a single text message. I told him how dirty it felt to be discarded like an afterthought, to be labeled his second option, as though I was some consolation prize for his failed fantasies. Then, I addressed the woman I suspected was his first option. It didn't matter if she was real or just a ghost from his past. I wanted him to know I had sensed her presence in the shadows of our marriage. I reminded him that while he had been chasing an illusion, I had been building a life for us, a life he didn't deserve. The twist came at the end. I revealed that while he thought he was walking away on his terms, I had already taken the first step. Along with the letter, I enclosed 2 official notices, one for our divorce and one for the house vacancy. The lease was ending in a week and he would have to deal with the logistics of finding a new place and shifting out. I didn't care where he went. It wasn't my problem anymore. I signed the letter with not just anger and bitterness but also with the quiet dignity he had tried to strip from me. I didn't want to be a woman who put a man's needs above her own. On my final day in the house I left the letter on the kitchen counter, weighed down with the pieces of his favorite coffee mug, a small ironic touch that gave me more satisfaction than I expected. I looked around the house one last time. It was just a shell of the marriage I was leaving behind. I locked the door and walked away without looking back. Update 2. Leaving the house felt like shedding skin that no longer fit, but it didn't make the wounds hurt any less. The first night in my new, tiny apartment was unbearable. The walls seemed to close in on me, and the silence was far from comforting. It only amplified the chaos in my head. I spent hours lying on a mattress I had dragged in from a discount store, staring at the ceiling and wondering if I had made a mistake by walking away. But then, I pushed myself up. There was a flicker of clarity. I didn't need to tiptoe around the shadows of a failed marriage. I didn't have to wonder if my husband's distant gaze meant he was thinking about her. This space was mine, however small, however imperfect, and it was a start. I knew the landlady. She owned a bakery, and she was nice enough to let me move in on such a short notice. At least I wasn't entirely on my own. Over the next few days, the grief hit hardest like a tidal wave I couldn't outrun. I'd sit by the window, tears streaming down my face as I replayed the good memories and questioned why they hadn't been enough for him. I had to take time off. I was absolutely distraught. My friends tried to rally around me, but I wasn't ready to face them just yet. I didn't have much family. How could I explain that the life they envied, the doting husband, the beautiful home, the picture-perfect anniversary trip, had been a lie? Their pity would have been unbearable. So I leaned on the one person who truly understood my silence, my best friend. Kelly. Kelly showed up the second I told her where I'd moved, arms full of groceries and enough wine to last a month. She didn't pry or offer cliches about time healing all wounds. Instead, she sat with me on the floor of my unfurnished living room, letting me rant, cry, and occasionally laugh at how absurdly awful everything felt. She didn't leave, she basically moved in with me. I felt much less alone. Even the landlady left me cookies every day. It was during one of those wine-soaked evenings with Kelly that I realized something. He may have broken my sense of security, my trust and even my self-worth for a while, but he hadn't stolen me. Somewhere beneath the rubble of our marriage, the ambitious, vibrant, hopeful version of me was still there. Update 3. Exactly 2 weeks after I left, the call came. I had anticipated it. It wasn't a question of if he would call, but when. Still, when his name lit up my phone screen, I froze. My hand hovered over the device as my heart pounded. I knew he still had access to the house. The landlord informed me that his things were still there. I let it ring, unsure if I had the strength to answer. His voice, even after everything, still had the power to unravel me. Finally, I swiped to pick up, steeling myself for whatever he would throw at me. The first thing I heard was his ragged breathing, the kind of sound someone makes when their emotions are barely in check. It was so loud, I couldn't have imagined it. His voice when he finally spoke was cracked and desperate, filled with remorse I had never heard before. He said he had come back to an empty house to the letter I'd left and the notices that accompanied it. He sounded stunned, as though he hadn't believed I was capable of walking away until he saw the evidence in front of him. He started apologizing, his words tumbling out in a chaotic mess. He said he didn't know what had come over him, that he hadn't realized how much he'd taken from me for granted until it was too late. He said he missed me, that the house felt cold and lifeless without me there. He admitted he'd been selfish, letting his doubts and unresolved feelings poison our marriage. I listened in silence, my grip on the phone tightening as his words poured out. He sounded like a man teetering on the edge, his confidence shattered, his bravado gone. For a moment I felt a flicker of pity. This was the man I had loved, the one I had dreamed of spending my life with. But then I remembered the text he sent, the callous way he had discarded me at the airport like luggage he no longer wanted to claim. He said he was willing to do whatever it took to fix things, that he couldn't stand the thought of losing me. His voice broke when he said my name, pleading with me to give him a second chance. A lump formed in my throat, but it wasn't enough to drown out the anger, embarrassment and shame I felt for choosing him as a life partner. I interrupted him, my voice steadier than I expected. I told him I had already filed for divorce, and as he could see, I was serious about it. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked. He asked why I hadn't told him, why I hadn't called or texted him about this, why I hadn't given him a chance to prove that he could be better. His tone was accusatory, as if I were the one at fault for giving up too soon. I didn't hold back. I told him I had spent years giving him chances, sacrificing my own happiness for the sake of a marriage he had treated like an obligation. I reminded him that while I had been planning our future, he had been living in the past, chasing a fantasy that didn't include me. His tears and apologies couldn't undo the damage he had caused or erase the words he had so carelessly said that day at the airport. He kept pleading. He promised that things would be different this time, that he would go to therapy, and that he would do whatever it took to make me happy. He said he hadn't realized how much I meant to him until he saw the house stripped of my presence, until he read my words and felt the weight of what he had lost. The temptation to believe that he could change didn't overpower how I felt at the airport. I thought about the nights I had spent crying alone, the humiliation of being abandoned so publicly, and the endless compromises I had made for a man who never once met me halfway. I asked him if he knew how I felt when he abandoned me at the airport. I told him he could have told me face to face. I yelled at him that the whole airport scenario didn't have to happen at all. I said I was done. The rawness in my voice seemed to shock him. I said that while I still wished him the best, not really, I wasn't interested in being part of his redemption story. I didn't want to be the woman who stayed, the woman who forgave, the woman who bent until she broke. I deserved better than that. There was a long pause before he asked, almost in a whisper, if we could meet in person to talk. He said he needed to see me, to explain himself properly, to show me how much he regretted his actions. I hesitated. I wanted to see the pain on his face and feel the satisfaction of knowing he finally understood what he had lost. But I knew that meeting him would only drag me back into the chaos I was trying so hard to escape. I told him I would think about it, though we both knew my answer was already no. I told him I would meet him for legal obligations though. When the call ended, I sat in the quiet of my apartment, staring at the phone in my hand. I had thought his remorse would bring me closure, that hearing him beg for forgiveness would heal some of the wounds he had inflicted, but instead, I felt nothing. His regret didn't undo what he had done, and his tears didn't lessen the pain I had endured. I poured myself a glass of wine and stood by the window watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. I didn't need him to have a happy ending. I promised myself I would never give up on it. Update 4. Kelly continued to be my rock, showing up unannounced with coffee or dragging me out for impromptu dinners. One night as we shared a plate of nachos at our favorite diner, she told me I seemed different, maybe a little happier than before. It had been 2 months after I left. I received a message from him. My lawyer helped me deal with him mostly and there wasn't much to split. I should have at least married rich if I had to deal with so much trauma. Crying on a cruise didn't seem too bad. The message said he had accepted the divorce and was signing the papers. He thanked me for the years we had shared before marriage and after and admitted that he had been wrong to take me for granted. He said he hoped I would find the happiness I deserved. I sent a short reply, thanking him for his honesty and wishing him the best. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was my way of letting go. Days passed and life carried on. While scrolling through social media, I saw a post that made my heart stop. It was on his account, the woman he had once chosen over me. He had tagged her in a picture, a blurry shot of them at a bar with a caption that made my stomach churn. Some things are worth waiting for. I couldn't help but laugh. It wasn't a bitter laugh but one of genuine amusement. After everything, after all his tears and apologies, he had gone back to her. The irony was almost poetic. This was his pattern, his way of filling the voids in his life with people he didn't know how to value. It wasn't about me or her. I closed the app and turned my attention back to my day. There were better things to focus on in life. Update 5. 2 days after I saw the picture of him and his ex, my phone rang again. His name flashed on the screen and for a brief moment I considered ignoring it. I'd already closed the door on that chapter of my life. What more could he possibly have to say? I thought, let's get it over with. His voice was shaky when I answered as if he'd spent hours working up the courage to call. He started by asking how I was, but I could hear the hesitation in his tone, the way he struggled to sound casual when his desperation was practically oozing through the phone. He said he wanted to talk about the divorce and that he wasn't ready to give up on us. I let out a short laugh. More incredulous than amused, I asked him what had changed since his last message, the one where he so graciously accepted the divorce. His answer came in a rush, words tumbling over each other as he tried to explain. He said he'd made a mistake by letting me go, that seeing me leave had made him realize how much he needed me in his life. I interrupted him saying that it didn't look like he meant it. He caught on immediately. He said the picture with his ex meant nothing, that it was just a night out with an old friend and people were reading too much into it. He claimed he was still in love with me, that he couldn't imagine a future without me. I let him ramble, my silence fueling his desperation. His voice cracked as he begged me to reconsider and to give him one more chance. He said he was willing to go to therapy to do whatever it took to fix things. He said he couldn't believe I had given up on us so easily. That was the breaking point for me. Easily? I cut him off mid-sentence, my voice sharper than I had intended. I told him if he thought this was easy, he hadn't been paying attention. I told him he didn't even have the dignity to leave me respectfully. I told him to look at the damage he had done. Of the years I spent being his emotional punching bag, his second choice, his afterthought. He tried to interrupt but I didn't let him. I told him that his regrets didn't erase the hurt he had caused or the humiliation of being abandoned at an airport because he didn't have the guts to be honest. I told him that his tears didn't undo the text he sent, the one that shattered my trust and left me questioning my own worth. He started apologizing again but I wasn't interested in his apologies. I told him I had seen the picture with his ex and that it confirmed everything I already knew about him. I said that he wasn't capable of being alone, that he was so desperate for validation that he would cling to anyone who gave him the attention he craved. His voice rose, defensive now. He insisted that the picture was taken out of context and the eye was overreacting. He said he didn't love her, that he had only reached out to her because he was lonely. I couldn't stop the laugh that escaped me. That was exactly what I was saying. I told him his loneliness wasn't my problem anymore. I said if he had spent half as much effort trying to make our marriage work as he's now begging me to come back, we wouldn't be in this situation. He started to cry then, his voice breaking as he begged me to reconsider. He said he couldn't handle the thought of losing me, that he didn't know how to move on without me. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. Then I delivered the words I knew would shatter what was left of his fragile ego. I told him I wasn't the one who needed to move on. He was. I said that I had already started building a life without him, one that didn't revolve around his moods or his insecurities. I told him that I didn't miss him, not even a little, and that the only thing I regretted was marrying him. I could practically hear his heart breaking, his pride crumbling. I didn't want to be harsh, but hearing him just made me so angry. When he finally spoke, his voice was small, almost childlike. He asked if there was anything he could do to change my mind. I told him the only thing he could do was show up in 6 months to finalize the divorce. Until then, I didn't want to hear from him, see him, or even think about him. I said that this wasn't a negotiation, that there was nothing left to salvage. He started to protest, but I cut him off. I told him I was done wasting my energy on someone who couldn't appreciate me until it was too late. I said that I deserved better and I wasn't going to settle for anything less ever again. I ended the call before he could respond. 6 months later I would see him again, but it would be on my terms. Update 6. I got a notification on my phone. The same woman from the picture I had seen weeks ago. The one who had so smugly leaned into him while he grinned like a man with no shame. My stomach twisted as I stared at her name. What could she possibly want? I didn't open the message right away. I knew that engaging with her would only drag me back into a drama I had no interest in revisiting. Still, the notification sat there, a glaring reminder of the tangled web of my ex's decisions. Later that evening, after debating with myself, I opened the message, skimming it quickly. She started by introducing herself as if I didn't already know who she was. Then she launched into what felt like an oddly familiar tone, saying she hoped I wouldn't find her message inappropriate, but that she thought it was time to clear the air. She said she knew about the divorce and wanted to assure me that she had nothing to do with it. She claimed she and my ex had reconnected only after he told her we were separating. She emphasized that they were just friends now and that she hoped I could understand there were no bad intentions on her part. Did she expect me to thank her for her gracious explanation? She even dared to suggest that if I ever wanted to talk, she'd be happy to clarify things further. Clarify things? What exactly was there to clarify? My ex had already made his priorities clear the moment he abandoned me at that airport. She wasn't the reason my marriage had fallen apart, he was. But that didn't mean I owed her a conversation or my forgiveness. I thought about replying, but then I stopped myself. Engaging with her would give her exactly what she wanted: attention, validation, and a sense of control, and I refused to give her any of that. Instead, I deleted the message, blocking her profile immediately after. My silence was my answer. The next day, I mentioned it casually to Kelly, who rolled her eyes so hard I thought they might get stuck. She said the ex's reach-out was just a cheap attempt to absolve herself of guilt or to add more fuel to the fire. Kelly reminded me that my silence was the best response, and I knew she was right. After that, I put the incident out of my mind. I had wasted enough time on people who thrived on chaos and attention. The best thing I could do for myself was to keep moving forward, leaving them all behind where they belonged.